The night Marcus Hayes pulled his truck to the shoulder of Route 11, he had no plan other than getting home before the storm turned the roads into rivers. He was tired in the way only single fathers who run their own businesses understand, a tiredness that sits behind the eyes and in the shoulders, and does not leave even after sleep, because the next morning brings the same weight all over again. He had closed the garage 45 minutes early, something he almost never did, because the sky had gone a shade of green-gray that made even the most pragmatic man reconsider his schedule. The rain was already ticking against the windshield in hard, irregular bursts, and the wind had picked up enough to send a fast food wrapper spiraling past the headlights, like something urgent was being communicated. Marcus noticed the sedan before he noticed the woman, a silver car, parked halfway into the grass. Hazard lights blinking amber in the dark, one rear tire sitting at an angle that told the whole story without a word being spoken. Marcus Hayes was 38 years old, and he had been quietly surviving for most of them. He had grown up in a mid-sized Ohio town where men fixed things with their hands and didn't talk much about what hurt them inside. And somewhere in his 30s he had come to accept that this was simply who he was. He was not unfriendly. Anyone who had brought a car into his garage on Clement Avenue would have told you he was one of the most decent men they'd ever done business with. The kind of mechanic who showed you the broken part before he replaced it, who didn't invent problems to inflate a bill, who remembered which customer had the daughter with the soccer tournament and asked about it the following week. But Marcus kept a careful perimeter around himself, the kind built not from arrogance, but from grief. Because 5 years earlier, his wife, Dana, had died from a brain aneurysm on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and the version of Marcus who trusted easily had been buried alongside her. He had a 7-year-old daughter named Sophie, who stayed with his mother-in-law on the late nights when jobs ran long, and his world had organized itself entirely around those two anchors: the child and the work, with almost no room left for anything else. He told himself he was fine with this. Most days, he almost believed it. The garage on Clement had been his father's, and Marcus had taken it over at 26, expanded it modestly, built a reputation on honesty and skill. He employed 2 other mechanics: an older man named Ray, who had worked for his father and showed no interest in retiring, and a 24-year-old named Darius, who was fast with his hands and faster with his opinions. The business was not glamorous, but it was stable, and stability, Marcus had decided, was the highest aspiration a man in his position could reasonably hold. He drove a 12-year-old pickup truck, not because he couldn't afford better, but because he had never seen the point. He lived in a 3-bedroom house on a quiet street in a neighborhood where people waved from their driveways and minded their business, and he did his best to give Sophie a life that felt warm and whole, even when the space her mother had once occupied was so loudly, constantly empty. He had not been on a date in 4 years. He had not been interested in being on one. He thought, on the evenings when he allowed himself to think about such things, that this chapter of his life was simply what it was, and that trying to write a different one would only lead to complications he couldn't afford. He was the kind of man who expected nothing extraordinary and made no room for it. That was about to change. The rain was coming down in full curtains now, and Marcus sat with his truck idling on the shoulder, watching the sedan's hazards pulse in the dark. There was no other traffic on this stretch of road. It was a back connector route that locals used to avoid the highway, and at this hour in this weather, no one reasonable was out. He could see a figure standing beside the car, not sheltering inside it, just standing there in the rain. He pulled on his hood, grabbed a small flashlight from the glove box, and got out. She was standing very still. That was the first thing he noticed, not the expensive coat that was dark and heavy with water, not the heeled boots that had not been designed for gravel shoulders, but the stillness. Most people caught in a bad situation move continuously, checking their phone, shifting their weight, pacing in small circles. This woman stood as though she had reached an internal decision to simply wait. And Marcus, who had been reading people across a repair shop counter for over a decade, recognized this as something uncommon. She turned when his flashlight swept across the car, and he got his first look at her face, dark eyes, sharp and calm, the composure of someone who was genuinely frightened but had chosen not to show it. She was perhaps 34 or 35, with the kind of bone structure that would have been striking under any circumstances and was, even now, soaking wet at the edge of a dark road in a rainstorm. "You all right?" Marcus said, which was approximately the least useful question he could have asked, given that she was clearly not all right. But it was the doorway into every such conversation, and he walked through it. "I'm fine," she said. Which was an even less accurate answer. But she said it without hostility, just reflexively, the way people do when they've spent years fielding that question from people who don't really mean it. "Your car's not starting?" he asked, nodding toward the sedan. She shook her head once. He moved the flashlight toward the engine bay. "Mind if I take a look?" She hesitated a flicker, barely visible, then said, "Please." The problem was immediately clear. A serpentine belt had snapped, and in this weather, with no tools beyond what Marcus kept in his truck, there was no fixing it tonight. He told her so, straight and without apology, the way he always delivered unwelcome news, and watched her absorb it. She didn't react dramatically. She nodded. The way someone nods when they already suspected the answer, but had been hoping to be wrong. He asked if she wanted him to call a tow. She looked at her phone. The screen was dark, the charge gone, and something moved across her face. Not panic exactly, but the recognition of a problem she couldn't solve with the tools she had available. She told him the phone was dead. He offered his. She held it for a moment, and then, very quietly, admitted that she didn't know who to call, that there was no one nearby she could reach, that she'd been driving to get away from something and hadn't thought through what would happen if the car gave out. Marcus put that sentence away for later examination, because there was something in the texture of it that asked more questions than it answered. But he didn't ask them. It wasn't his habit to push into spaces he hadn't been invited. "There's a motel about 18 miles up," he said. "But in this rain, the roads out there are already flooding. I know because I drove it this morning." She said nothing. He said, "I live about 7 minutes from here. If you want, you can stay the night, and we'll sort the car out tomorrow." He said it matter-of-factly, the way he might offer a customer a loaner vehicle, because it was practical, and because leaving a woman alone on a dark road in a storm was simply not something he was capable of doing. She looked at him for a long moment, measuring something, running some calculation that he couldn't see, and he understood enough about human nature to know she was deciding whether he was safe. He didn't try to convince her. He just waited, because people who try too hard to seem trustworthy usually aren't. "Okay," she said finally. "Thank you." Her name, she told him during the 7-minute drive, was Elena. She did not offer a last name. He did not ask. The house was warm inside in the way. Houses only are when someone has been living in them with intention, not decorated elaborately, but cared for, the kind of clean that comes from routine rather than performance. Sophie's drawings were pinned to the refrigerator, bright and slightly crooked. A row of small shoes by the door. A paperback novel left open on the arm of the couch. Elena stood in the entrance and looked around the way people look at things that surprise them, and Marcus handed her a towel and pointed her toward the bathroom and found a dry sweatshirt and a pair of sweatpants that had belonged to Dana and that he'd kept without quite knowing why. He made pasta spaghetti with a sauce from a jar that he improved with garlic and a bay leaf, which was the extent of his culinary ambition, and he put on coffee because it was cold and late, and coffee was the clearest language he knew for hospitality. She came out of the bathroom looking like a different person. Not lesser, the composure was still there, but softer, somehow, or perhaps just warmer, the performance of self-containment temporarily set aside because there was no audience for it here. They ate at the kitchen table, and Marcus kept the conversation light and directionless in the way he did with new customers until they relaxed, letting her lead, and she surprised him by asking questions rather than deflecting them. She asked about the garage, and he told her, briefly, the history of it, his father, the handoff, the two mechanics he trusted like family, the satisfaction of knowing that every car that left his lot was safer than when it arrived. She listened with a quality of attention that Marcus noticed because he was not used to it, the kind where someone is actually processing what you say rather than preparing their own response. He asked, in return, what she did, and she said, with a slight pause before it, that she worked in finance. He nodded. He didn't follow up, and she looked at him again with that measuring quality, as though his lack of curiosity was itself a data point. She asked, gently, whether he lived here alone with his daughter, and he said yes, and told her about Sophie in the straightforward way. He always did, smart kid, loved dinosaurs and painting, and had recently decided she was going to be a marine biologist, which he supported completely, even though the nearest ocean was several hundred miles away. He mentioned Dana without intending to, some natural extension of the story that brought her into it, and then paused, and Elena said, quietly, "How long ago?" And he said 5 years. And she said she was sorry. And he said, "Thank you." And it was one of those exchanges that manages to carry genuine weight in very few words. Elena was quiet for a moment after that. She was holding her coffee mug in both hands, staring at some point in the middle distance, and Marcus recognized the expression because he had worn it himself, the look of someone deciding how much of their own story to let out. She said, after a moment, that she understood what it meant to lose someone and have your whole sense of the future rearrange itself. She didn't elaborate. He didn't press, but the room shifted a little, the way it does when two people stop occupying the same space politely and start actually being in it together. He set her up in the guest room, the one he kept clean because Sophie's friends sometimes slept over. Fresh towels on the bed, and a phone charger on the nightstand. He told her what time he usually got up and offered to drive her back to the car in the morning. She thanked him, and the word carried more in it than a simple thank you usually does. He could hear the weight behind it, the recognition of something beyond mere logistics. He went to bed without giving the evening much more thought, because he was tired. And because extending kindness to someone in need was simply what you did. And in Marcus Hayes's understanding of the world, it did not require reflection. What woke him the next morning was nothing dramatic. The alarm, 6:30 as always. He went through his usual sequence. Shower, dressed, start the coffee, open the blinds in the kitchen. He stood at the window with his mug and looked out. And stopped. Stopped. Completely, because the street outside his house, a quiet residential street where the most eventful thing that usually happened was an argument over a recycling bin placement, was lined from one end to the other with black Range Rovers. He counted without meaning to the habit of a precise man and reached 22 before the street curved. 22 black Range Rovers, parked with the orderly precision of a military operation. And standing beside them and along the sidewalk, in dark suits with the posture of men who are trained to stand that way, were more people than Marcus had seen on his street collectively in the entire time he'd lived there. His first thought was that he was still asleep. His second thought was that something had happened to a neighbor, some federal situation he'd had no knowledge of. Some investigation that had landed on his street by coincidence. His third thought arrived when Elena came out of the guest room, already dressed in the clothes she'd arrived in, which had dried overnight, and walked to the front door and opened it. And the 22 men with the posture of people paid to be vigilant all, in a single coordinated movement, turned to face her. One of them stepped forward. She spoke to him briefly, quietly, and he nodded and stepped back. And the others remained exactly as they were. Elena turned back inside. Marcus was standing in the kitchen doorway with his coffee mug. And whatever expression was on his face, she met it with something that looked like the particular resignation of a person who has put off a difficult conversation for as long as possible and has now run out of time. "I owe you an explanation," she said. He set the mug down on the counter. "I think that's fair," he said. Her full name was Elena Carter. She said it without the dramatic pause it probably deserved, because she was not someone who performed her own significance, which was, she would reflect later, part of the problem. The Carter family had built one of the largest private investment portfolios in the country over 3 generations. And Elena, as the sole surviving heir of her father's estate, controlled a financial organization that managed assets valued at something in the neighborhood of $12 billion. She was on the boards of 7 companies. She was, in the language of the world she operated in, a figure of considerable power and reach. She was also, she said quietly, sitting at Marcus's kitchen table, with her hands around a borrowed mug, someone who had spent the better part of the previous 3 weeks trying to determine which of the people closest to her had been systematically misrepresenting financial data to the board in a way that would have ultimately redirected hundreds of millions of dollars into private accounts, and who had, when the walls of the situation began to close in, gotten into her car one evening and simply driven, which was not a sophisticated coping mechanism but was the only one she'd had available at the time. She had turned her phone off deliberately. The car breaking down had been entirely unplanned. She had been, in every practical sense, as stranded as she'd appeared, because the versions of help she could ordinarily access all required her to be findable, and findable was the one thing she had chosen not to be. Until Marcus had pulled over, she watched him while she explained all of this, and he listened the way he did everything without performance, without the visible recalculations that most people did when the stakes of a conversation suddenly shifted. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So those are your people out there?" It was not a question. She said yes. He picked his coffee mug back up and looked out the window at the convoy on his street. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Are you safe?" She said yes to both. He nodded once and said, "Then we should get your car sorted. I'll call the shop and have Ray bring the right belt. It's an easy fix, 40 minutes, maybe less." Elena stared at him. In her experience, which was extensive and conducted almost exclusively among people for whom information was currency, the revelation of who she was produced a predictable and nearly universal response. There were variations, excitement, calculation, nervous deference, performative casualness that barely concealed its own eagerness, but the response was always a response, always a visible recalibration of the relationship based on what was now known. Marcus Hayes looked at the street full of Range Rovers, confirmed she was safe, and offered to fix her car. It was so far outside the pattern she'd come to expect that she found she had nothing to say. He made her breakfast while he was at it, eggs and toast. The same thing he made himself on weekday mornings, nothing special, and called Ray, who arrived with the part 90 minutes later and fixed the sedan on the shoulder of Route 11 in 38 minutes, which was faster than even Marcus had predicted, though he said nothing about this when she thanked him for the estimate. Ray, who had known Marcus for 20 years and understood the rhythms of his employer's character, managed to ask no questions about the convoy that had been on the street that morning, though his expression when he returned to the shop that afternoon was one of profound curiosity carefully suppressed. Elena had offered to pay for the repair and for Marcus's time. He quoted her the standard rate for the belt and the labor, added nothing, and refused when she tried to double it. She had pressed once. He had said, politely but with finality, that he'd given her a price, and that was the price, and she had let it go. She left with her convoy in the mid-morning, and Marcus went to the garage and opened it for the day and told Ray and Darius nothing about what had happened, and by noon the whole episode had taken on the quality of something half-remembered, vivid in the feelings it produced, but already slightly unreal at the edges. It lasted almost 4 days before the world caught up with him. Somewhere in the timeline of Elena's disappearance and reappearance, a detail had leaked. It was never entirely clear how. But such things rarely are, because information moves through enough hands that origin becomes untraceable. What emerged in the tabloid coverage first, and then in more serious reporting, was approximately this. Elena Carter, one of the wealthiest and most closely watched figures in American business, had gone off-grid for several days and had resurfaced from the home of an unknown mechanic in a small Ohio suburb. The interpretation that the story received in its early hours was precisely what you would expect from people who had made careers out of assuming the worst about human motivation. The suggestion, stated with various degrees of directness depending on the outlet, was that Marcus Hayes was not a mechanic who had helped a stranger, but a sophisticated operator who had engineered an encounter with one of the country's most powerful women, for reasons that were left to the imagination of the reader, which was generous to neither party. Reporters showed up at Clement Avenue first, then at his house. His phone, which he'd had the same number for 11 years, began ringing with calls from numbers he didn't recognize, and the content of the messages ranged from the merely intrusive to the genuinely hostile. A television van sat outside the garage for 2 days. Ray and Darius handled the customers with the studied indifference of people who have decided not to dignify a situation with acknowledgement, and Marcus continued to work, because the cars still needed fixing, and the bills still needed paying, and Sophie, who was 7 and observant, had asked him why there were people with cameras outside, and he had told her it was a misunderstanding that would sort itself out. He believed this when he said it, which was either admirable or naive, or possibly both. He did not reach out to Elena. It did not occur to him that this was within his rights. They had exchanged phone numbers in the morning, briefly, in the functional way of two people who might need to coordinate logistics, but contacting her now would have felt like taking advantage of a connection made under specific circumstances, and Marcus's understanding of integrity included a fairly precise sense of where lines were. Elena was not similarly restrained, because she had resources he didn't, and because what was happening to him was a direct consequence of her presence in his life, and she was not someone who ignored the downstream effects of her own decisions. She had her team track the coverage in real time, and by the second day she had a complete picture of the narrative that was being constructed about Marcus Hayes, and it made her quietly, cleanly furious in the way that only injustice directed at someone who doesn't deserve it can produce. There was also, tangled up in the anger, something that functioned more like guilt. She had brought this to his door, to his quiet street, to his life that had been arranged with such deliberate care around the things that mattered to him, and the thought of Sophie seeing camera crews outside her father's garage was enough to move Elena from consideration to action. She called a press conference. This in itself was not unusual. Elena Carter called press conferences with some regularity, because the business she ran was large enough that events required public management. What was unusual was the subject, and the uncharacteristic directness with which she addressed it. She stood at a podium in the Carter Group's main conference room, her communications team arranged behind her, and she said, with the clarity of someone who has decided to prioritize accuracy over strategy, that she would like to correct the public record regarding the events of the past week. She told the story as it had happened. She had been driving alone, having made a personal decision to step away from her devices for reasons that were her own. Her car had broken down. A man named Marcus Hayes, whom she had never previously met, had pulled over in a rainstorm and offered help. He had offered the guest room in his home because there was nowhere else available and the weather was dangerous. He had made her pasta and coffee and asked no questions that he wasn't owed answers to. He had listened to her talk about his wife. He had made breakfast. He had fixed her car at a fair rate. He had not asked for anything else, not money beyond what was owed, not introductions, not opportunities, not acknowledgement of who she was, because at the time he helped her, he did not know who she was, and when she told him, his primary concern was whether she was safe and whether her car could be repaired. She said this last part twice, clearly, because she wanted it to register. A man who had never met her, who had no knowledge of her name or her resources, or what either might mean for his own life, had done something for her purely because it was the right thing to do. She said that this was, in her considered experience, uncommon enough to be worth protecting. She said she would be consulting her legal team regarding the outlets that had characterized Marcus Hayes in ways that bore no relationship to the facts of his character or his actions. The press conference was recorded. It was broadcast that evening, and clipped and circulated, and watched by a large number of people, because there was something in the straightforward quality of it. A woman of significant means and influence, insisting on the basic dignity of someone who couldn't protect himself from the machine of public narrative that cut through in a way that more managed communications rarely do. Marcus watched it on the news that night after Sophie was asleep, sitting on the couch with the volume low. And he sat with it for a while, without deciding how to feel. The calls and the cameras didn't stop immediately, but they shifted in tone, shifted in content, shifted in the story they were trying to tell. The narrative that emerged from the coverage over the following week was softer and stranger than the one that had preceded it, because the facts themselves were strange in a way that was resistant to cynicism. A man with no outstanding debts, and no prior public profile, and no apparent motive, had helped someone he didn't know, and then gone back to work. The simplicity of it bothered people who expected complexity. Some of them, unable to locate the angle, simply reported what had happened. And a few of them did so beautifully, because occasionally, the actual story is the best one available. Marcus was not changed by the attention in the ways the attention expected him to be. He remained at the garage. He did not hire a publicist, or give extended interviews, or appear on morning programs. A reporter from a national magazine reached him by phone and asked if he'd sit for a profile. And he said he didn't think so. And when the reporter asked why, he said because he hadn't done anything that required a profile. He sounded neither falsely modest nor performatively humble. He sounded. the reporter would later tell a colleague, like a man who genuinely believed what he was saying, which was disorienting in the media landscape, and probably explained why the story wouldn't let go of the public imagination. Marcus Hayes was being covered, in part, because he so clearly did not want to be. The legal situation inside Elena's company resolved itself over the following months, with the methodical deliberateness of corporate investigations, conducted at the level where money is old enough to move slowly. The individuals responsible for the financial irregularities were identified, and the consequences arranged with the specificity that significant liability tends to produce. Elena emerged from this process without the dramatic vindication of a public trial, but with the quieter, more durable satisfaction of a problem correctly solved. She returned to her work with the addition of several structural reforms she had been planning to implement before the crisis, and which the crisis had, ironically, accelerated. She did not take another unplanned drive, but she did, in the weeks after the press conference, find herself thinking about the kitchen in the small house on the quiet street in Ohio more than the situation strictly warranted. She thought about the drawings on the refrigerator. She thought about the pasta, which had been genuinely good, better than many meals she'd eaten in restaurants with names and reputations and chefs whose careers she could have ended with a phone call. She thought about what it felt like to sit at a table and be asked about nothing more than what she cared about and what she'd lost, to be in the presence of someone whose interest in her had no component of what she represented or what she controlled. She thought about this more than was comfortable, and with the self-awareness of someone who had spent considerable time in therapy, she recognized what the thinking was and did not pretend it was something else. 4 months after the night of the rainstorm, on a Saturday afternoon in the early part of a mild spring, a car pulled up in front of Marcus's house. Not a Range Rover, not a convoy, a single, ordinary sedan. A different one from the one that had broken down on Route 11, rented from the airport because she had taken a commercial flight and not chartered anything, and had arranged her own rental car, and had given her security team the afternoon off, in a way they did not entirely love but had learned not to argue about. Elena Carter walked up the front path of the house on the quiet street alone, carrying nothing, and rang the bell. Marcus answered the door in a paint-stained sweatshirt, because Sophie had been doing a project that morning, and he had been helping with it, and he had the expression of someone who is mildly surprised, but not unwilling. He looked at her for a moment, and then he stepped back and held the door open, which was the only invitation she needed. Sophie was at the kitchen table with an assortment of paper and glue, and something that was aspiring to be a model of a coral reef, and she looked at the visitor with the frank curiosity of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to manage her reactions for social purposes. Elena sat down across from her and asked what she was building. And Sophie explained the entire project, in considerable and biologically impressive detail, including 3 facts about clownfish that Elena had not previously known and which she filed away with genuine interest. Marcus put coffee on and leaned against the counter and watched the two of them talk, and felt something that took him a moment to name. It was the feeling of a house that has held its breath for a long time, finally, quietly, letting it out. They sat on the porch after Sophie went inside to finish the reef. The afternoon was warm enough for it, and they talked the way people talk when they've been thinking about a conversation for longer than is easy to admit. Elena said things she had been rehearsing, and other things she hadn't planned at all, and Marcus listened with the same quality of attention she had noticed on the night of the storm, the kind that costs something from the person giving it. She said that she had been thinking about what the evening had meant to her, in ways that went beyond the obvious, that it had arrived at a specific moment in her life when she had been struggling to locate evidence that the framework she used to understand people, transactional, strategic, always aware of the incentive structure, might be incomplete. That Marcus had been, without knowing it, and without intending it, the evidence. He was quiet for a moment when she finished. Then he said that he hadn't done anything that required a lot of philosophy. He'd seen someone who needed help and had some to offer. She looked at him and said that she knew he believed that, and that the fact that he believed it was precisely the point. He looked out at the yard, where a robin had landed near Sophie's neglected swing set, and he said, after a while, that he thought he understood what she meant. That sometimes you do a small thing, and it turns out to have mattered more than you knew. And you can't decide in advance which small things those will be, so you just try to do them all. She said that was it. That was exactly it. The robin hopped twice and flew off. Somewhere inside the house, Sophie made a triumphant sound that probably meant the coral reef had achieved some structural milestone. The afternoon light was doing what late spring afternoon light does in Ohio, which is to stretch itself long and golden across everything and make ordinary things look like they've been thought about. Marcus poured more coffee from the pot he'd brought out, and Elena held out her mug, and they sat there in the easy silence of two people who have decided, without needing to announce it, that the distance between them is no longer what it was. The convoy would not come back. The cameras had long since moved on. The story had been told and absorbed, and had joined the inventory of things people mention when they are trying to articulate what they believe about human nature and whether the evidence supports optimism. Marcus's garage remained on Clement Avenue, where Ray still worked and Darius still moved fast, and the sign above the door still said Hayes Auto in the same faded lettering his father had put up 30 years ago. Sophie grew half an inch that spring and developed a new obsession with narwhal whales that Marcus learned more about than he would have thought possible. Elena returned to New York and to the work that demanded her. But she returned to Ohio as well, on weekends that accumulated gradually and without drama into a pattern, and the guest room stopped being thought of as the guest room, in the way that rooms sometimes rearrange their meanings. There are things that cannot be planned for, and a man who has decided his life will be quiet and contained and free of the unpredictable is not, in the end, immune to them. The rain comes when it comes. The car breaks down where it breaks down. The person who pulls over is the person who pulls over, for reasons that are rooted in character and not in calculation, and those reasons are what they are, regardless of whether the stranded woman is anyone important or no one at all. Marcus Hayes had not known who Elena Carter was. He had known who he was. And it turned out that this was the only information that mattered. She had told him, on the porch that Saturday afternoon, that he had saved her from the rain. He had said, and meant it, that he'd only given a stranger a place to sleep. She had told him he was wrong, that what he'd given her was something harder to name and harder to find, which was the simple proof that a person could still do a thing because it was right, with no calculation underneath it, no awareness of what it might return. She had been looking for evidence that this still existed in the world, without knowing she was looking for it. And she had found it in a mechanic's kitchen at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, over pasta and coffee, in a house where a child's drawings were pinned to the refrigerator and a paperback novel waited on the arm of a couch. The largest things in a life do not always announce themselves. They arrive quietly, dressed in ordinary circumstances, a storm, a broken belt, a truck pulling to the shoulder of a road, because that is what a certain kind of person does when they see someone who needs help. They require nothing more of you than to be exactly who you are. And if you have spent years being quietly, carefully, consistently yourself, it turns out that this is more than enough. It turns out, in fact, that this is everything. What Marcus understood about grief, the particular kind that comes from losing a person who was the organizing principle of your daily life, was that it did not diminish so much as it reorganized. In the first year after Dana died, he had functioned by reducing the variables, less of everything that wasn't essential, fewer conversations, fewer evenings that ran late, fewer questions asked of himself about what came next. Sophie had needed stability. And stability had needed Marcus to become, in some respects, smaller, not diminished exactly, but contained, carefully bounded, all his energy directed toward the tasks that mattered and away from the territory where grief might find purchase. He had been good at this. He was constitutionally suited to it. But the thing about reducing your perimeter is that you can get comfortable inside it. And comfort begins to feel like the correct size. And eventually, you stop noticing that you've stopped growing. He had not thought of himself as a man who was waiting for something. He had thought of himself as a man who was finished with wanting things he couldn't have, which is a different posture and feels, from the inside, like wisdom. The garage was real. Sophie was real. Ray's dry commentary every morning was real. And the particular satisfaction of a well-diagnosed problem and a correctly executed repair was real. These were the anchors, and he held to them with both hands, and on the evenings when the house was very quiet after Sophie was asleep, and the quality of the silence had a weight to it, he recognized, but did not name. He read or he watched something, and he did not follow the thread of whatever that feeling was pulling at. The night of the storm had not felt significant while it was happening. This was, he reflected later, perhaps the truest thing about it. The moments that change a life rarely arrive with the gravity they deserve, because the self that is being changed does not yet know what it's worth. He had made pasta. He had made coffee. He had listened, because listening cost him nothing, and he had learned, across years of work and fatherhood and solitary evenings, that what most people needed more than advice or solutions was the simple experience of being heard by someone who wasn't waiting for them to finish so they could speak. Elena had not needed to be saved in any heroic sense. She had needed, for a few hours, to be in a room where she wasn't the most powerful person present, where no one wanted anything from her, where the conversation moved at whatever pace it moved, and stopped where it stopped, and no one managed the pauses. He had provided this accidentally, which was the only way it could have been provided, because any deliberate version of it would have been a performance, and she would have seen through it in the first 30 seconds. She was very good at identifying performances. Ray had told Darius the morning after the press conference aired that Marcus was the same man he'd been the day before it, and Darius had said that was obvious, and Ray had said that it shouldn't be obvious, that it was actually remarkable, and Darius had thought about this for a moment and agreed. Marcus had come in that morning and looked at the vehicle schedule for the day and asked about a part that had been on back order, and when a reporter knocked on the garage door around 11, he had said, without rudeness but without any opening for negotiation, that he didn't have anything to say and they should have a good day, and then returned to the car he'd been working on. Darius had watched this and felt something adjacent to awe, which was not an emotion he associated with his employer but which, he decided, fit. Sophie asked him once, about 3 weeks after the press conference, whether the lady they kept talking about on the news was someone he knew. He had said yes, briefly, that she was someone whose car had broken down, and he'd helped her out. Sophie had said, with the directness that she had apparently inherited from both of her parents, whether she was nice. He had said she was very nice. Sophie had nodded, satisfied, and returned to her book. And the conversation was over, and Marcus had thought that this was one of the things he loved about children. The cleanness of their logic, the efficiency of it, the willingness to accept a complete answer and move on. What Sophie did not know, and what Marcus himself had only gradually assembled from the coverage he'd consumed reluctantly over those weeks, was the fuller picture of what Elena had been navigating in the period before the breakdown on Route 11. The investigation inside the Carter Group had been, by any reasonable measure, a serious and sustained crisis. Someone she had trusted, in some cases for many years, had been operating in bad faith, and the process of identifying that person had required Elena to treat everyone around her as a potential suspect while maintaining the outward composure that her position demanded. She had described this to Marcus later, on one of the Ohio weekends, as the most isolating experience of her professional life, not the crisis itself, which she'd had the skills to manage, but the loneliness of it, the way it had hollowed out every relationship, because every relationship had become potentially compromised. The night she'd gotten in the car and driven was not a breakdown in any clinical sense. It was closer to a deliberate interruption, a conscious decision to insert a space between herself and the situation in which she was embedded, and if the car hadn't broken down, she would have eventually turned around and driven back to her life, and no one would have been any wiser. The broken belt had not been part of the plan, but then, most of the things worth telling are the ones that weren't. Marcus had listened to this and said that it sounded exhausting, and she had said yes, it had been, and something in the plainness of his response, the fact that he didn't try to contextualize her experience or relate it to something in his own life or offer a reframe had been, she said, oddly relieving. She was so accustomed to people responding to her with utility, trying to add value to every exchange, that the simple acknowledgement of a hard thing without any attempt to fix or improve it registered as a form of care she hadn't known she was missing. They talked, across those weekend visits that accumulated through spring and into summer, about many things, and also about the things that don't organize themselves into topics: the texture of daily life, the way time moves differently in different seasons, the particular quality of light in Ohio in July which is relentless and specific, and which Elena said reminded her of something from her childhood she couldn't quite locate. Marcus showed her the garage on a Saturday when it was quiet, and Ray had gone fishing, and she stood in the bay and looked at the lift and the organized wall of tools, and said that this was one of the most satisfying-looking rooms she'd ever seen, which was such a specific and accurate observation that he had laughed, genuinely, which she logged as something valuable because it was clearly not a sound he produced for social purposes. Sophie warmed to her in the measured, watchful way that children warm to new people, testing the relationship with small disclosures and monitoring the response before offering larger ones. And Elena passed each of these tests without appearing to take them, which Sophie registered, without being able to articulate why she felt comfortable. There was a Saturday in late August when it rained again. Not a storm this time, but the slow, gray, steady rain of late summer, and the three of them were inside, and Sophie was watching a nature documentary about the deep ocean, completely absorbed, and Marcus and Elena were in the kitchen, and he was making coffee, and she was leaning against the counter talking about something she'd read that week, and the domesticity of the scene was so complete and so unremarkable that Marcus stopped in the middle of reaching for a mug and stood very still for a moment because he had the sensation of being in a life that had recently become larger than he'd expected it to be, and he was trying to determine whether this frightened him or whether he was simply not used to it yet. He decided, after a moment, that it was the latter, that the feeling was not fear but adjustment, the kind that happens when something good arrives in a space that has been empty long enough to have forgotten what full felt like. Some things are irreducible. A man pulls over in the rain. A woman accepts the offer of a room. A child explains the social behavior of narwhal whales. To someone who is genuinely interested, coffee is made and poured and refilled. The afternoon goes long. The year turns. The things that change a life do not always know they're doing it, and neither does the life. It is only in retrospect, looking back at the accumulation of small, ordinary moments that constituted the threshold, that you can see where the crossing happened. And even then, the most honest thing you can say is that it started in a rainstorm. That it started because someone didn't drive past. The world is full of people who would have driven past that car on Route 11. This is not a judgment. It was raining hard. It was late, and the calculus of risk and inconvenience that most people apply in such situations is not unreasonable. Marcus drove past nothing. This was not heroism. It was not even, in his own accounting, a decision. It was simply the expression of a character formed over 38 years of living by a code that didn't require constant renegotiation with itself. You stopped when someone needed help. You offered what you had. You didn't attach conditions. These were not difficult principles, but their consistent application over time turns out to be rarer than it should be, and that rarity is what gives them their weight in a world that tends to negotiate everything. Marcus Hayes did not become famous. He became, briefly, visible, which is a different and considerably less comfortable thing, and then the visibility receded, as it always does, and he remained what he had always been. A careful and decent man who ran an honest business on Clement Avenue and raised his daughter, and was, if you pressed him on the subject of his life as it now stood, quietly grateful for it. Sophie's coral reef eventually achieved its final form and was displayed on the dresser in her room. Slightly asymmetrical but structurally sound, labeled in her best handwriting with the names of every species she'd included. Marcus photographed it, because he photographed most things Sophie made, because this was the record he was keeping of a life that was, whatever else it was, full.